Next on the agenda is an update from Michael on the National Public Safety Broadband Network.
That thing doesn't like you, Michael.
Let's go in here. All right. A little over a month ago, the FCC published an order that required the PSCC OAC, which is the 21 safety broadband waiver recipients, of which Mesa has is one for Arizona, to select a numeric identifier administrator by February 8th, and that is February 8th, 1 month after their order came out, not February 8th, a year later.
My little baby.
To complete the development of the numbering scheme by March 31st, and then choose a clearinghouse provider by May 31st. Now, this numbering scheme within the Public Safety Broadband Network is all the numeric identifiers needed for all the subscriber gear, like basically a device ID or the equivalent of SIM card for your cell network, and all the identifiers for the infrastructure equipment that makes up the Public Safety Broadband Network. So it's fundamental in terms of the infrastructure for the build-outs that are going on in the waiver recipient areas in their jurisdictions. The waiver recipient group had been working with Public Safety Communications Program out of Colorado and vendors in discussing various approaches and how we're going to deal with the kind of the key winch portion of this numeric identifier is the PLMN ID, and there were discussions on does each jurisdiction have their own PLMN ID, or do we have a national singular public safety broadband PLMN ID that makes it an entire network nationwide. So the discussions were going on. So they rapidly put together all the ideas into a single document, which is published out on the PSCR website. So there's the URL there. A short-term solution, the FCC order says, well, you can work on an RFP approach or you can work through a federal agency. Well, given that the waiver recipient groups are singular jurisdictions, there's no singular governance entity that can come up with an RFP, and an RFP process takes a lot longer than 4 weeks. So we worked with the OEC and selected SAIC, which is a long-standing contract provider to the OEC, and many public safety entities and SWICs nationwide have utilized their services. They actually managed the CASM application for the National Repository of Public Safety Communications equipment. The plan is to establish a 1-year arrangement, short-term, where the waiver recipients set the requirements. The OEC will put forth the contract and pay SIAC to establish the numbering scheme and administer. Now, this aggressive timeline is being driven by the FCC needing to make decisions for the waiver recipients, particularly Charlotte, North Carolina, Harris County, Adams County, and the state of Mississippi, who are all under BTOP schedule deadlines and milestones. So, can't say it's all an FCC problem because they're being driven by the request from these waiver recipients to make decisions and move forward. And Charlotte, North Carolina actually is where the Democratic National Convention is. They've got a hard deadline to meet that convention. Long-term solutions, in much of the proposed legislation that's in Congress federally, there is mention of the creation of some form of commission to manage the public safety broadband network. This numbering scheme administration would be part of their responsibility, but that hasn't happened yet. And in discussions that I've been involved with. There's a strong tendency towards requesting state-level authority and responsibility for administering the numbering scheme within the state, because they recognize that states probably have a better idea how their jurisdictions interact, and so working through AZPSIC or through the equivalent of the SIEC, which is our PSCC, at various states to come up with a national yet regulated by states kind of approach. Some of the things that state level administration might oversee would be the establishment of the allocation in the state of the unique identifiers, guidelines on who can be on the network and who can't, how does roaming amongst jurisdictions within the state and how federal agencies or national agencies like fire service interact with the local jurisdictions, and then, of course, to assure interoperability. I mentioned the PLMN ID. It has been agreed by the FCC and jurisdictions involved to establish a single PLMN ID, which means it will be a singular network. By default, there's a high degree of interoperability. Anybody who's a subscriber here or cell phone, the equivalent has been set up with the equivalent of a SIM card on the public safety broadband network. It will be recognized in Miami, Chicago, Phoenix, whatever. I mean, it'll be, you're on the equivalent of AT&T. Don't move. All right. That brings along issues about managing this numeric numbering scheme, because it has to factor in all jurisdictions nationally at the same time. So one proposal is to figure out how many IDs are available, divvy them up by FEMA region, and then within FEMA region by state, and the divvying up would be a weighted blend of population, geographical area, number of crimes, number of disasters, number of UASIs. As a pilot, as a test, Cynthia Cole out of Synergize put together this kind of allocation, and Arizona ended up with 5 million IMSIs, which is the user device IDs, which, given our population and number of public safety entities, both primary, secondary, seems like a lot. But once we start down this road, we'll probably end up with a lot of additional, besides user ID, individual subscribers, machine-to-machine, RFID, and so forth. I mean, the number of IDs needed will proliferate just as we've seen in the cellular networks. Okay, so this FCC order has accelerated the need to get ahead. We've kind of been standing back and letting it gel in terms of waiting for legislation and real-life funds behind the scenes to move before we started, really getting into this. But unfortunately, in my mind anyway, this numbering scheme issue, and along with it, the third bullet point, the PSCC has formed a governance working group to make recommendations on how the public safety broadband network should be managed. Again, being driven by the very real fact that we're divvying up numbers, we're allocating numbers, and how are those numbers going to interact in terms of local jurisdictions and neighboring jurisdictions and so on and so forth. We'd like to get input from the PSCC and SIEC regarding the proposals put forth by these working groups, and basically open up who'd like to be involved. Or any other groups that we might engage on this.
So, Michael, I have a question. So, as they allocate these IDs, is there? So, I'm going to relate it to networking. So, I mean, is there concept of a subnet mask so you can allocate a specific kind of?
There are about 15 different IDs. Some of the IDs are temporary to assure efficiency and so on and so forth in terms of, well, I don't have to go back to the home network to identify this individual every time they get on the network, switch cell towers. They can kind of cluster, and it's a whole new jargon to get going on this stuff, because LTE is in its infancy even in the commercial world. And so public safety, lucky public safety gets to live the pain just like anybody else. But to your point, the issues around all that numbering and all that, I think we avoided a lot of pain and agony by going with a single PLMN ID, because that kind of unifies the users. But then it brings on other issues of
managing.
An example is Mason Topaz, when they ran their cost found that they would have to bring on all government employees to float the costs of the maintenance. That brings in strata of first responders, secondary responders, public works, so on and so forth. So it really emphasizes the issue of having a good set of governance in terms of who has priority on the network when, things like that.
Other questions, please?
Steve Gell, what kind of time frame are we on? Because I'm going to admit I'm going to admit quite a bit of ignorance when it comes to this area, because I think it's still evolving. And I think to answer your question about what other groups should be involved, as a commission, I think we might want to have a little more information as far as where we're going and what kind of time frame we might be working on.
Well, and agreed. And I was hoping not to bring any of this up until the FCC put out that order and said, okay, it's time to move. Again, it's only 21 jurisdictions currently. It's not national, and it won't be a national until there's legislation and funding. So somewhere between, my concern is making sure that you are aware that this temporary solution is going to be put in place really soon, and those temporary solutions have a tendency to evolve into the long term. So we aren't asking for your decision or input right away. It's just making sure you're aware of it and how should we act and how should we move forward representing Arizona.
Sure. Thanks.
And if you want more information, let me know and we'll provide it.
So Mike, help me just understand this a little bit better. So are the feds kind of running this from a centralized perspective, or are multiple states kind of collaborating on this?
It's the waiver recipient group is the primary drivers, because they're being driven by their VTOP grant deadlines and milestones. Okay, and so you've got VTOP, the waiver recipients, the OEC and the FCC, and ERIC, which is the federal entity that's part of FCC that's supposed to be driving the public safety broadband. But a very small group, relatively.
Right. Absolutely. So what's the VTOP's role? Those groups?
There were 7 or 8 VTOP grants, some in the ballpark of $54 million, some big dollars.
Right.
And they're basically driving as a normal VTOP grant and have their milestones and have their schedules and so on and so forth. There have been some decision points that had to be deferred on some of these grants because the schedules wouldn't permit going through the governance and so forth needed to make a decision, so they kind of left it by the wayside.
Right. So there's some pretty immediate deadlines that are going to kind of be moving forward on this, right?
Right.
So I don't know that we know enough to kind of take action or move forward. I mean, is there more information, would you say, kind of progressively on
Well,
this?
they just formed that governance working group
Yep.
this week.
Okay.
as information evolves and comes out of that, I would definitely be reporting back to the PSCC and requesting input on it.
Can you go to the dates, Michael?
Sure. Let's go back.
So I'm looking at the dates. They're going to be making some decisions between now and May.
Right.
We only meet every other month.
Right.
So Michael's just simply saying, if anybody wants to work with him on this, we're tracking it, from our office's perspective.
Right.
He's going to stay active in it, and we'll ask the same thing of the SIAC and our interested parties list as well. Anyone who's got, obviously we work with maybe Topaz and Tucson, et cetera, who are our waiver, either recipients or waiver requesters in our state who have an interest in this, early adopters.
Right.
But if anyone else, he wants to make sure that that sort of they're setting a stage now between now and the summer that may have impact on what it looks like in the long term. So we just wanted to make sure that you're telescoping that.
Yeah, even if it's an email list of interested parties, again, because we only meet every other month, it's kind of difficult to, actually last week it dawned on me, oh my God, I better take the opportunity.
That's great.
So if anyone does have interest, please email Michael. We'll get you guys plugged in. Otherwise, Michael will look to you to continue to keep us informed and educate us on this as we move forward. Thank you very much.